Hey everybody, I wanted to film a quick little video on something that I find to be very important from an endocrinology standpoint for medical school and physiology, and just really many areas of life. I feel like the brain with endocrinology is a very fascinating area, but a very challenging area. So I wanted to kind of go through and kind of explain different areas of endocrinology and kind of start with the idea of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary and the adrenal gland. The hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are commonly referred to as the hypophysial portal system, which is actually the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Most of the time it's called the HPA, axis as we kind of know it. But it's a really, really important system that kind of regulates many different processes in the body. So there's a part of the brain called the thalamus, and the thalamus sits above the hypothalamus, kind of no shock there, right? Thalamus above, hypo below. And the hypothalamus is really important for homeostasis, whereas the precursor, kind of the one above it, the thalamus, is more so important for like a relay station in the brain. It relays a lot of signals for processes that are, kind of keep us aware of our surroundings, like auditory, visual, stuff like that. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus are, again, really important for, maintaining our surroundings. The hypothalamus, again, more so for that homeostasis. And what the hypothalamus does is it releases many different types of releasing hormones all throughout the body. So these releasing hormones could be things like CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, and that's coming from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. You also have other nuclei, for example, like the supraoptic nuclei, which, have roles in things like oxytocin release and water balance, etc. But again, many different nuclei in the hypothalamus. The main one that we're going to be talking about here is CRH coming from the paraventricular nucleus. So what happens is the hypothalamus gets a signal, it releases CRH, and it's very interesting, right? The hypothalamus is connected to that anterior pituitary via something called the hypophyseal portal system. It's actually venous in nature. So this is, again, going to be the hypophyseal portal system, and it's going to be venous in nature. I kind of just abbreviated there, HPS. This venous system is very similar to the hepatic portal system, which is the second venous portal system in the body. There's also one arterial one. Just for completeness sake, I put it up here. It's actually the renal portal system. But anyways, you have CRH being released from the hypothalamus. It flows down this venous portal system to get to the anterior pituitary. And in the anterior pituitary, what we have is ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin hormone, being released in response to this CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Anytime you kind of hear the word releasing, you should be thinking of a precursor, probably coming from the hypothalamus. An example would be growth hormone releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, which is going to cause growth hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary. You can also have, as I kind of just messed up and said early, you could have gonadotropin releasing hormone coming again from the hypothalamus. It's a releasing hormone, gonadotropin causing the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. Now, these hormones from the anterior pituitary, FSH, LH, ACTH, T, SH, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone, all of these have so many different important roles in the body. So a lot of these will go into the adrenal gland, for example, or they'll go into the thyroid with TSH, and they'll do many different things. So realizing that the releasing hormones come from the hypothalamus, causing the release of further hormones that do many other functions. A lot of them is going to be signaling to different glands or organs throughout the body coming from the anterior pituitary is really important. Again, we kind of talked about the portal system up here, hepatic and hypophyseal being venous, and then again, renal being arterial. And then we get down to the end here, and we talked about the idea at the beginning that you have the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the adrenal gland kind of functioning together. Well, in the adrenal gland here, what you have is you have the adrenal cortex, and then you have the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla is going to be very important for things like catecholamines. This is your fight or flight response. This is essentially the age-old example is if you see a bear in the woods, adrenal medulla, you're having epinephrine, adrenaline is another name for it, or neuroepinephrine, neuroadrenaline shooting up throughout your system, right? Because again, you're having a fight or flight response. You're getting nervous. Your adrenal medulla is trying to get you to run away. Now, you can also have another thing here called the adrenal cortex, right? The adrenal cortex is coming from the mesodermal embryonic layer. That's going to be releasing things like aldosterone from the zona glomerulosa, which is just one of the layers of the adrenal cortex, or cortisol from the zona fasciculata, or you could have the last one there from the zona reticularis, which is going to be releasing DHEA and androstenedione. So this is really, really important, right? Again, realizing you have the hypothalamus going to the anterior pituitary, going to the adrenal gland, two different parts of the adrenal gland, adrenal cortex from the mesoderm, adrenal medulla from the neural crest origin, one of them causing fight or flight, one of them causing more homeostatic functions, if you will. Aldosterone, obviously really important from the zona glomerulosa for salt and water reabsorption, the zona fasciculata with cortisol. Obviously, that's stress hormone, right? Something we don't want to have too much of, but we don't want to have too little of. And then you have the zona reticularis, which is going to be important for sex hormones like DHEA and androstenedione. So these are really, really important parts of the adrenal cortex. Now, I kind of, lay this whole picture out because what I really want to talk about is the ACTH and the idea of the dexamethasone suppression test. And we're going to talk about this in the next video. But what I wanted to talk about early was ACTH and its roles in determining kind of whether there's some sort of tumor, which we call an adenoma in this case, or whether it's going to be some sort of other cancer like a small cell lung cancer. So what we essentially see here is we see ACTH from the anterior pituitary. If it's released only from the anterior pituitary, that's going to be known as something that's called Cushing's disease. And Cushing's disease is something that's going to cause a person to have these very noticeable features, right? They're going to have abdominal striae, which is this kind of like easily bruising band across their stomach. It's because the vessels are getting weak. You're going to see things like abdominal obesity. You're going to see things like a buffalo. Again, a hump on the back. You're going to see things like moon face, which is a swollen face. And I'll put up a picture on the screen of what Cushing's disease actually is. And that's because you have an anterior pituitary adenoma, which is basically releasing ACTH unabated. And ACTH is causing the further release of cortisol, and you have this giant mess because there's no negative feedback that would normally occur. Right? Cortisol should usually go back and negatively inhibit the anterior pituitary. It should negatively inhibit the hypothalamus. But if cortisol can't respond to an anterior pituitary because there's a tumor, then there's your problem. There's no negative feedback, and you're going to have a very high level of cortisol in order for that to really, have any effect on the anterior pituitary. There's also another big distinction. One word makes a huge difference, right? Cushing's disease, again, immediately think anterior pituitary adenoma, only from the anterior pituitary. Cushing syndrome, you should be thinking of, well, this means that it's coming from somewhere else, not the anterior pituitary. Anywhere else in the body besides the anterior pituitary, the most common place Cushing syndrome develops is ACTH being released from cells in the form of small cell lung cancer cells in the lung. This is usually in the center of the lung in smokers, and ACTH is being released. Again, it's going to that adrenal cortex. It's causing the zona fasciculata to release a bunch of cortisol, and you're kind of having, again, the symptoms, the same clinical presentation, abdominal striae, obesity, etc., but it's just coming from a different area. Again, Cushing's disease, anterior pituitary, Cushing syndrome, most likely small cell lung cancer, both of them causing similar symptoms, but completely different in nature. And of course, that makes a huge difference, right? Cushing's disease, we have to treat the anterior pituitary. Cushing syndrome, that person needs small cell lung cancer treatment, which is a much harder disease to treat, right? Lung cancer, #1 killer in the United States for cancers. Again, and then you have the adrenal adenoma. Adrenal adenoma could be kind of lumped in sometimes with this Cushing syndrome category, but it's completely different, right? Adrenal adenoma is a tumor in the zona fasciculata layer of the adrenal gland. And at the zona fasciculata, you're releasing cortisol, and that cortisol is causing, again, similar symptoms, right? But it's completely different. Cushing's disease, anterior pituitary ACTH release, causing these symptoms after cortisol is released. Cushing syndrome, small cell lung cancer, causing ACTH release, again, causing cortisol to be released from the zona fasciculata, but it's completely different, again, in terms of the pathological process occurring. Same thing for adrenal adenoma. You might sometimes hear, oh, well, it's causing Cushing syndrome, but an adrenal adenoma is really caused by a tumor in the zona fasciculata layer. What that's doing is it's causing the release of cortisol. Finally, you have the dexamethasone suppression test. What it'll tell us where the tumor actually is. This is a very useful test, of course, in addition to imaging. We could see if it's Cushing's disease, Cushing syndrome, or again, the adrenal adenoma by doing this dexamethasone suppression test. There's also other tests as well. You have the 24-hour, again, urinary cortisol test, again, and then you can also have, again, the salivary cortisol level. I believe it's at midnight as well, so that could be something that's important. But we'll talk about that in part 2. Again, really big picture, realize you have the hypothalamus, communicating with the anterior pituitary via releasing hormones via venous system. That's going to the adrenal gland, which is releasing further hormones. And we really talked about ACTH, realizing Cushing's disease versus Cushing syndrome versus adrenal adenoma. Thanks for watching, guys.